I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir and J, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Today, we are talking about the exciting topic of creating clones of ourselves in the digital world. And we're joined by our postdoctoral fellow, Cody Turner. Welcome, Cody.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jay. Excited to talk about this.
Nir, you were the one who pointed us to this. What excited you about the podcast Shell Game?
So Evan Ratliff, a journalist with an interest in tech, decided that he would create a voice clone of himself and then let it loose on the world. And what he did was hit up a company that is apparently very good at taking voice data and cloning your voice.
That be links in the show notes.
Yep. And he linked that up with ChatGPT and with his phone, and then started sort of sending it out on missions. So, it called his friends for social calls. It did some business calls for him, like, I have some weird charges on my credit card or on my cable TV account or whatever. He had it talk to some of his family members. He satisfyingly had it talk to scammers. And, essentially, he didn't always tell people. He always told people afterwards and got their permission to use it for the podcast. But I guess the idea was to see how much of this you can get away with, what kind of functions of yourself you can replace, what the responses would be from others, what it would do to your relationships, what it would do to you. And I thought it was a cool experiment. So as you guys listened to it, what responses did you have?
Cody?
Well, as we were talking about before we started recording, one of my biggest takeaways is that this technology is far from being perfected. The lengths that he went to construct this personalized digital duplicate and how often it failed. I mean, there is the fact that the technology is progressing at a rapid rate, right? So he was doing this experiment and he was expending a ton of effort to make this digital duplicate, and then some software would come out that would just make his life so much easier. So does seem to be exponentially progressing, but yeah, it doesn't seem like it's at the point yet where it could actually be like practically useful in terms of like enhancing your productivity or actually trusting it to offload different functions in your life. That was one of my main takeaways.
Yeah, just to sort of emphasize that. The two main issues were latency, namely the response of the journalist was Evan Ratliff. So the Evan bot was sort of slow to respond, awkwardly slow. That made conversations weird. And then the tone, and anyone who has used chatbots is going to be familiar with this, the tone was kind of stiff and wooden and a bit sort of awkward. That being said, the voice was perfect.
Yeah.
The voice itself was perfect.
It got a lot of intonations and complex kind of emotional timbres correct, which I thought was interesting. So one of the interactors described his voice as cocaine-y, and that it always maintained a kind of high, positive tenor of some kind, which was another giveaway.
Yeah.
But I thought, this is just the beginning, and so much progress has been made in the last 5 years. I keep looking beyond the failures of the initial experiment to where it's going to go pretty quickly.
And concretely, I mean, the latency problem, so the delay problem, which is the main source of weirdness, probably, because we already know that ChatGPT is capable of not being awkward and wooden, and is being made awkward and wooden mainly for liability purposes at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But the main latency issue is that the technology is first translating sound into text, and then its responses from text into sound, and that takes a few seconds. And so, as they explained in the podcast, if our usual response time as humans is a third of a second, this could take up to 3 seconds, and that's a huge difference. But I know that OpenAI has come up with a solution for that already in some ways that they haven't released yet. So like you say, Jay, we got to assume that the latency problem is going to go away in like 6 months or a year. And I guess you're right. Let's think about it. And then what? So basically, what if you could clone yourself or your voice, right, to sound perfectly like you, both in tone and in latency, and start sending it out to do your work, to do your personal calls, to
Well, just on the latency thing, a lot of our communication is not by voice. It's by text and email and whatnot. And
yeah,
there, the latency, no one would ever notice, right? So it
that's
just
right.
has to get your um,
Right.
written ID, right?
Right, but there's something particularly intimate about voice. I mean, I guess what we're talking about is that potentially 3 years from now, this podcast could be done by our avatars, and you could feed it enough of our previous podcasts and previous writings and previous interviews and previous talks or whatever to, be as annoying as we are.
Okay,
Uh,
there's my segue to high theory. I, I think one of the big things that's going to happen is, and that happens in the course of this podcast, is he starts adding more of his contextual life details and facts about his relationship with his friends to the context memory of the personal agent. And as a consequence, it becomes more, I think, in those interactions, it becomes more convincing because it says, hey, we went on that vacation or whatever. The degree to which we are our memory, right? So this is the high theory part, is what is your view on personal identity? But the degree to which we are simply our memories, one of the interesting things I think that's happening is as we offload and start relying on external memory about our lives, the 2 terabytes of videos and photos that I have of my raising our kids in our history, all the documents, all the calendars, all the facts, most of which we would never be able to personally remember in our organic brain, but now become a corpus of knowledge about ourselves that only can be accessed electronically. And to the extent that that is now in the cloud, I think it raises a question about personal identity. Where do you guys go with that?
So just one thing I would say to kind of slightly translate this into more accessible terms. So what's at stake here is that this AI clone, right?
Yeah.
You can, if you want it to be very effective, you can feed it with an autobiography of yourself in some basic way. And actually, in the podcast, Evan Ratliff does that, right? So you essentially write a memoir for it, and that memoir becomes part of the AI's memory, and it relies on it as it interacts with other people. And you raise an amazing point. What if you combine that memoir with all of your videos, photos, audio, with all of the digital stuff that we already have in our Google Pictures or in our Photos applications in the cloud on our Macs, etc. It can get a sort of memory database for you. And I guess the question you're asking is, to the extent that our personality, our personal identity is based on memory, are you moving a lot closer to human-like interaction? Cody, where do you fall on that?
Yeah, just a few more remarks I just want to make real quick on the ways in which it's less than ideal that in the podcast. Beyond the latency problem, there were just some funny instances where, he'd send off his digital duplicate to engage in like a customer service interaction, and it would mirror the customer service representative, or it would say like ChatGPT is out of like free tokens for the day. So there's those obvious points, but then there are other ways.
It was kind of neurodiverse in that it would get stuck in repetition loops that you sometimes see in
Right. Yeah. And it was
business
almost
fiction.
it was almost too polite beyond the latency thing, right? Like there's just kind of nuanced ways in which it's still in the uncanny valley. It's like too polite. It's almost too perfect in some ways, and that doesn't rely on verbal crutches.
Right.
So yeah, all
It
those
would say
things.
things like, "I'm fine. How are you?" And then they would say something that's like, "Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I'm fine. How are you?"
Yeah, like lacks like just like social understanding about how to like navigate social interactions in a normal way.
Yeah.
But yeah, going to the personal identity question, I mean, there are different theories in personal identity about what makes, first of all, there are different personal identity questions in the philosophy of personal identity. Two are often like attribution identity versus diachronic identity. Diachronic identity being what makes you the same person over time, what makes me the same person today as I was when I was 5 years old. Attribution identity more being, what characteristics, personality traits can we attribute to a person? So I think both of those are relevant when we're asking whether a digital representation of self can be a part of our personal identity. And I think the memory point is crucial because a lot of traditional theories of personal identity emphasize memory, right? Like that's what Locke said, his kind of classic memory theory of personal identity, right? It's like the psychological continuity via consciousness and memory that makes me the same person today as I was when I was 5 years old, right? And even if I don't remember some event when I was 5 years old, my 15-year-old self remembers that event, and I remember my 15-year-old self. So there's like a causal through line. And then, in addition to the psychological theory, another popular theory of personal identity is a kind of sometimes it's regarded as an offshoot of the psychological theory, sometimes it's regarded as a competitor, but it's what you might call the narrative theory of personal identity, which says that our personhood is really constructed via the kind of life narrative that we actively construct throughout time. And narrative theorists tend to take a different stance on the nature of human memory compared to like psychological continuity theorists. Like psychological continuity theorists often see memory as like all the detail of memory is like kept in these kind of like discrete compartments of the mind. Whereas narrative theorists say, no, memory doesn't really work like that. It's much more integrative. It's much more kind of like holistic.
Well, I think that's fascinating because it raises a whole nother dimension of how these agents could help or impact our personal identity, in that it will help us write those narratives and suggest narratives to us, right? Like with my Google Photos archive, it already suggests at the end of the year, it says, would you like us to put together a pastiche of the 5 trips that you took last year to Barcelona and et cetera, et cetera. So it knows that I went on a trip. It knows that I've got these pictures associated with it and wants to put it into a narrative for me. And I think it's that this kind of affordance will just be a common thing that comes out of these use of these tools.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. And from the standpoint of the narrative theory, you can see how digital technologies can kind of like scaffold our memory and like and bolster our personhood. But I think there is a question there about like, okay, on the narrative theory, how much of one's narrative should be actively constructed by oneself, right? Like if you're offloading all of your narrative construction to like Facebook memory or some sophisticated version of that, which is kind of like integrates everything for you and like gives you your story, you could say like, yeah, like it's like a great narrative and it's great that it's doing that for me, but it's kind of taking some of the autonomy out of like that active narrative construction. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think that's one like consideration there.
Right.
You know, but the weird thing is you could actually cover all your bases, whatever theory of personal identity you subscribe to. You could give it a bunch of raw data, like pictures and video and audio. You could also write an autobiography for it, right? You could literally give it a knowledge base of, write a 50-page memoir, which is actually a weird and interesting exercise, and give it to it. And ask it to draw on both of those and then sort of tweak it as you see its responses. And so it almost doesn't matter necessarily what your theory of personal identity is, because you could give the raw materials for both kinds of theories, not to talk about the fact that you could ask it to write a narrative for you based on the pictures and compare it to the narrative that you wrote for it, and so on and so forth.
I think it does matter what kind of theory of personal identity you have. I do not ascribe to the theory that there is an authentic self, right? I think all there is the selfing, the narrative self, the self we write about ourselves over time, which is constantly changing. And I think one of the terrifying things about what we're proposing here is that you could have a corpus of 2 terabytes of data about your life and your history, and it could be interpreted in all kinds of ways. It could be interpreted in a very negative light or a very positive light. And we see ourselves doing that with our own lives, depending on our psychological state of mind, right? The depressive is the person who reinterprets and only remembers the negative, and vice versa. Now, I presume these tools will not be programmed to only present to you a negative version of yourself. But what if it errs in the other direction? What if it only gives you the positive version of yourself?
Yeah.
I think that's a problem too.
I mean, but let me ask both of you a question. Assume it's 5 years from now and the voice clones pass the Turing tests. Namely, they don't suck like they do now. There's no latency. There's no woodenness. Maybe they're even combined with very good video. All of the technology for that is there. You just need to stitch it together a bit better. And I know a few months ago, the CEO of Zoom had this sort of infamous interview in which he said that the future is our digital clones having Zoom meetings with each other while the people who created them are, at the beach and just sort of intervening in an important moment. I guess my question, as usual, is what the hell is the point of that? Suppose it works perfectly, in other words, and suppose it actually gets a pretty authentic sense of your personal identity. You already have your personal identity. So, I mean, I guess I see answering shit calls. I guess I see calling Comcast with them screwing up your plan. But beyond that kind of stuff, like, why would you want, I mean, if you wanted to call your mom, isn't there something pretty problematic about your relationship with your mom that you should be fixing rather than sending clones to? If you wanted to call your friends, should you really be friends with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, one application that we already have been thinking about for a while is work. And so you can already imagine if you're a computer programmer and you are working from home and you've signed up for 2 full-time jobs, but they involve a lot of programming. You're in one job, you set a 2-hour computing process, and in another job, you set a 2-hour computing process. You're telepresent in both work settings. In this case, you might be able to have a work voice clone that could do functionally, half of a job for you. And I think that would be a great labor extender. Just in science fiction, there's a great example of an author trying to explore this scenario. And that's David Brin's Kiln People. And he has a scenario where you lie down in the morning in a special bed, and it kind of clones you into these other bodies made out of like mushroom or whatever. And those bodies can then think that they're you, or remember everything about you, and go out and do your job in whatever setting. And then at the end of the day, you get the decision about whether to download their memories back into yourself or not. If they did an unpleasant job, you just don't. But then they have the existential choice of doing something else. Now, for these voice clones, they don't have human intentionality yet. But I think that's one of the questions that we have to raise is how much intentionality are we going to be putting into these things? And if they decide to do things other than what we really wanted, and what does it mean for us to really want something? All of that is extremely complicated.
Yeah. I'm trying to imagine concretely how this translates into somebody's actual work life. So, for example, take us as university teachers. Would this be something like a larger lecture is being delivered interactively in my voice, by the way, which is nothing to write home about. So I would already enhance it and make it less monotone.
Right.
But
we need the cocaine version of Nir.
Exactly. Like the super cocaine, like high octane cocaine version of Nir. But so I'm like the Nir GPT, Nir bot is giving the lecture, and then real Nir is available for one-on-one tutorials, much more, something like that. So
right. The stuff you enjoy.
My anxiety is that Nirbot is going to be far more appealing to students than real Nir.
Nirbot becomes a Marxist, and while you weren't looking.
Yeah. Jay's gonna hack Nirbot.
Well, there is the question there. I mean, how manipulable these things are, right? Because already people are trying to use them for identity theft. But what if they could just just overwhelm your bot and use it?
Yeah. So is this? I mean, this is just one sort of use case, right? But is this world, Cody, what do you think? Is this world more attractive in any way?
My sense is, like you said, there's so many different use cases, and my intuition as to whether a particular use case is like permissible or ethically desirable is just going to be context dependent. I was reading to go back to your first question, an interesting paper by John Danaher and Sven Nyholm, where they're kind of responding. Dan Dennett, at the end of his life, the late philosopher, he considered digital duplicates and apparently was really against them. He came out against them. I think he even suggested banning them, if I'm remembering correctly. So they wrote this paper where they're saying, no, we shouldn't ban them, but they advocate for what they call the minimally viable permissibility principle. And the principle has a couple of parts. It says that if you're creating like a personalized digital duplicate of yourself in the way that we've been talking about, generally speaking, it's permissible if there's informed consent to its creation and ongoing use. At least there's some positive value that's generated from it. There's transparency, right? So not doing what the the guy and the journalist in the podcast was doing, right? Just not being transparent that this is a digital duplicate he's sending off to customer service representatives. And then the fourth part, which gets to your question that you asked a second ago, Nir, is what you might call the non-authenticity condition, right? Duplicates, they should only be used when real authentic presence isn't morally required, right? So when you gave the example of you're having a conversation with a long lost friend that you haven't seen in a year, that's a situation where, yeah, it's expected that it's going to be the real version of you. So there would be something morally problematic with not showing up as your real self there, right? So determining what context in which like authenticity is required and what context in which it might not be as big of a deal, like the kind of
no breakup bot.
Yeah.
right.
My sense though
Yeah.
is if you take those conditions seriously, that empties out the technology of all possible uses. So you'd have to get informed consent with from every possible interlocutor. So like you'd have to have a call that says kind of like our Zoom thing, this call is being recorded. You'd have to have something like saying, this call is being initiated by a robot. Everybody would opt out. First of all, I think just like you never pick up a scam
I think
call.
there are ways to indicate that without being that obtrusive. You could just be like, a formula of there's always going to be this icon on the screen or something.
Yeah, but who'd want to talk with a verified robot? Your friends probably wouldn't. I can't imagine.
I think
I would.
the more dystopian scenarios here are where not only where either you or your friends prefer the bot, right?
Yeah.
And what made me think about that is, would I prefer to only talk to the people that I call on the phone in voice, or would I prefer to be able to leave a voicemail message? And I think there was resistance. I don't know if you remember this, but there was resistance to voicemail and to answering machines back in the 1980s. And then people were like, why the hell don't you have a voicemail or an answering machine? Why is your voicemail always full when I call you? Because we would prefer to be able to have that kind of communication, even if we don't want the other kind. And then people began to not want the other kind.
I think that's a great way to frame it. Like, what situations would we prefer your digital duplicate, right? Like, if there's some artist that you admire and you don't like some political turn they've taken in the past couple of decades, so you want to communicate with a younger version of themselves, their younger digital duplicate. Or Nir, to your point, you're concerned about that principle that I just laid out being too like demanding. It's going to like take away all the use cases we're interested in because it sets the bar too high. Perhaps with respect to communicating with someone else's digital duplicate, but not for interpersonal uses of your own digital duplicate, right? Like I can imagine having an idealized version of me that's not tired, not sleepy. I might want to outsource decision-making processes to that idealized version, whether it's like financial planning. I know Jay's talked about using your digital duplicate as like a political proxy. So situations like that, I could definitely see myself preferring the kind of like idealized, rational digital duplicate Cody that never gets tired, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, this goes back to, the usual debates that prompted Jay and I to create this podcast in the first place. If you have an artist that you really like and has become an asshole politically, I'm not sure the best thing is to then create a version of them before they became a jerk. Maybe the better version is, I was obsessed with the Smiths and with Morrissey, and he took a pretty troubling political turn later in life. Maybe the psychologically healthier approach is, well, you suck it up. You deal with the fact that people, are both suck and are brilliant at the same time. And you are stuck with, tainted Morrissey or, whoever you want to stay with. There's something a little too easy, at least in my book, about the possibility of getting to talk with idealized Morrissey. So I'll give you maybe a more optimistic version of this. So I know that I just heard this conversation with Jill Lepore in which I believe she was talking about a AI voice clone created of the Brown versus Board of Education oral arguments. And that was supposed to help. I'm not 100% sure of the details, but my sense was that was supposed to sort of be an aid in history lessons, right? To make it more appealing. And there's a risk there of fake history, et cetera, all the deep fake problems. But if you sort of hold that constant, you could see how that would be a sort of very attractive pedagogical tool, right? If the voice was actually there. What's your sense of that use of the technology?
I'm interested in that use for sure. We were talking about that daily news article where I forget the researchers who did this, but they've been creating digital duplicates of famous philosophers, right? So that's another potential pedagogical use case. And in particular, dead philosophers to see what their perspectives would be on like contemporary philosophical problems that they never thought about or wrote about, which I think is an
Yeah.
interesting pedagogical use case. And when you start talking about those use cases, that gets into one particular often discussed example of digital duplicates is like death bots, right? Like creating
Yeah.
a digital simulation of someone's mind after they die. So
Yeah.
I'm interested to get both of your perspectives on just the general permissibility and your thinking around death bots.
Well,
Whether
let me
you'd want to
connect.
create a death bot of yourself. Yeah.
Let me connect the dots between death bots and what we were just talking about with the law, because it strikes me as fascinating that originalists are basically trying to construct in their mind digital duplicates of old white dead guys who wrote these documents, and with the Federalist Papers and whatever they're using to interpolate what the original intent was. And I don't think that they're really sincere in that. I think they have motivated reasoning, blah, blah, blah. But then the liberal interpretivists want to do and say the spirit of the document and the spirit of the time. And you can see it's like what would Jesus do bracelet? What does it actually mean? Does it mean what would an old Jewish prophet in Palestine have told you to do about transgender therapies for teens? Or what would the spirit of the New Testament do in telling you what to do? I think there's all these kinds of interpretations. But anyway, yeah, to the extent that we're trying to create woebots of old white dead guys, let's not do that. Let's go for the spirit of things. In terms of having a woebot of my grandmother or my mother or my father, I think it's a great idea. I've already put up web pages to them. I've got a bunch of recordings of them that I've worked on that I would love to do something with someday. I think people should commemorate the dead. I mean, that's one of the aspects of Asian culture that is annoying sometimes, but that I've always appreciated. Like my wife and I both have told our kids they have to have little shrines with our faces on them after we're gone, light candles at and then burn incense.
Yeah, I mean, not to insult your commemoration projects, which I respect greatly, but the question is if this is commemorating the dead or desecrating the memory of the dead in some way, right? So my problem with death bots in this context is that they take over the imagination. They become the version of memory, right? So to go back for a moment to the Brown case. If I study the AI version of the Brown oral arguments, that now becomes my understanding of Brown. And it's so much more compelling, right? It's so much more evocative to the imagination to have that than to read it in a book, that the book version, with all of its complexities and its need to, the need that it creates for you to use your imagination, doesn't stand a chance versus the generative AI version of it. So it better be pretty damn good, for example. Similarly, I guess so one worry I have is this kind of colonizing of the imagination, that this becomes the sort of official authorized version of the dead person or of the past event. Um, Now, beyond that, the
You mean
question,
like every time I think about Cleopatra, I see Elizabeth Taylor?
yeah, basically. Basically, well, that creates a special kind of responsibility for the creators of that. I've always thought about this in the context of Schindler's List, for example. There's an ethics of Schindler's List, right? Most of what a lot of people, it shouldn't be this way, but most of what a lot of people know about the series of events, about the Holocaust or about that, is going to come from these kind of popular culture representations because our historical knowledge and motivation to get it isn't amazing. And if the cultural representations suck or are tainted by commercial considerations or are inaccurate, et cetera, that at least raises a normative problem. So I think that
and
normative
and
problem translates
acting
to this
is
context.
acting is an industry that has been leading on trying to figure out what to do about the ownership of deepfakes and digital clones, by the way. So that
Right,
was
right,
implicit in
right.
the actor strike.
Right. But then maybe going back for a moment to Evan Ratliff's podcast, Shell Game, I think we're all struck by the last episode where he sort of lets his clone loose on his own family. His father was diagnosed with a kind of cancer, and he tells his father finally about the AI clone that he's made of himself. He first sort of sends his AI clone to talk to his father. He can't really take that for some reason, which is an interesting question in itself, why it feels so wrong to him. And then the dad, who's a tech enthusiast and an engineer and an expert on logistics and supply chains, says, I actually want my own voice clone, right? The dad says, I'd like a voice clone who has my knowledge about logistics to be a sort of resource for future students, which I found both very weird and very moving. But then it ends with this kind of weird conversation between Evan's voice clone and his dad's voice clone. And the Evan voice clone tries to ask the dad's voice clone about relationship. And the dad voice clone is like, I only want to talk about
Supply
logistics.
chains. Yeah.
Yeah, and who the hell are you? Right? And I couldn't help feeling, and Jay, this goes back to your project of robots. I couldn't help feeling that there was something, I'm not a very religious person at all, but that there was something sacrilegious about this, or that there was something, um, you know,
It meets
there
the
was some,
consent criteria because the father wanted it.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. Well, that might mean that the consent criteria is impoverished.
So it's unsanctified even if it's consented. Again,
Yeah.
I understand why people have those disgust reactions, but I think it's a disgust reaction to death, the simulacra of incomplete self.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a little bit like the point about Morrissey. Maybe we should just become better about being sad rather than creating fake versions of the people we're
Right.
sad about
When
losing.
the Buddha first died, he forbade any depictions and images of him. And
Mhm.
after 500 years, people said, "Yeah, we're going to forget that because we want pictures of you. We want, we
Yeah.
want to memorialize you." Now, would it be better to be? I don't know. Maybe the Anabaptists are like this. I really don't know, but I'm sure there were Christian sects that don't believe you should be commemorating the dead. And if you think about it in the context from all the way from China and Korea and Japan that have that as a central feature of folk religion to cultures that don't. I can see, being on the spectrum and saying, I don't think it's psychologically healthy to commemorate the dead at all. But I recognize that half of the world thinks having a shrine in every single home commemorating your dead is extremely important for a sense of continuity. And
So
if you could talk to it, I'm sure they already want to do that.
are you saying that these death bots are a version of a shrine?
Yes, I don't think precisely because it's going to be the person is going to be dead. Everyone will know that they're not talking to the person, right? They're talking to something else. But if they find comfort in it, maybe they only find comfort in it for 10 seconds and they get bored.
I don't know. I have a photo of my grandma behind me because I was really attached to her. And once in a while I look at it and I try to remember things we did together and conversations that we had and why I liked her so much and what she meant for me. But a grandma bot would be something really, really different. Especially because I feel it shuts down the imagination and replaces it. That process of you started out, both of you, by talking about memory. It shuts down that active remembering process, I think. But maybe this is just my automatic Luddism sort of acting up here. Cody, would you want a Woebot for your dearly departed?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at first, I think all the concerns that you're raising, I share, right? I mean, the grief point, right? For using it to kind of for the grieving process, it could definitely just prolong the grief and prevent you from getting over the loved one. And then also the concerns about the death bot being a misrepresentation of oneself, right? If someone created a death bot of myself and it, started behaving in a ways that are at odds with my actual personality. Yeah, that's like an affront to my dignity or something like that. Or even not a misrepresentation, but just a partial representation of my mind, right? Even if that partial representation is accurate, I still wouldn't be entirely comfortable with that because I'm like, wait, hold on. I was a lot more than this, right? I contain multitudes, but this death
Yeah.
bot, people think that I'm like, can be boiled down to this like partial representation. So I shared those concerns. I guess a few things I would say from the kind of pro deathbot perspective is, as it stands, especially older generations who don't really have any digital footprint and who haven't lived on the internet, they've mostly just been forgotten in history, unless like you're some famous person, right? Like a lot of my grandparents have passed over the past couple of years. I would love, some kind of, even if not a deathbot, some kind of like digital capsule to remember them by. So I'd say all of the concerns about how someone might be misremembered are valid, but the standard throughout history has largely been people are just forgotten in history because they don't have like digital remains. And then the other thing I would say is like, even if, one is against death bots for all the reasons that we've been citing, digital technologies still present all kinds of exciting possibilities for digital remembrance that fall short of death bots, right? Like I can imagine, in the future, everyone will have smart eye contact lenses where they'll be recording their life from their first person point of view. And then, let's say like I do that, and then my grandchildren will live in a world with technologically mature virtual reality technology. And now they can like experience what it was like being their grandfather at 30 years old in like this VR simulation based on my recording, right? So like there are different technological possibilities for digital remembrance that aren't death bots that can still capture a lot of the positives that we want to capture with death bots in terms of digital remembrance.
Let me just imagine a scenario that over the next 5 years, there's a lot of experimentation with different kinds of digital agents. And 5 years from now, there's 5 big kinds of death bots to choose from. There's the Google one, the Amazon one, the Microsoft one. And people choose one, they start investing in it, say another 5 years. Then by that time, I think we're going to have the capacity to say, this is the one that I have worked with the longest and that I have the most trust in. And if I were to die, this is the one that I want to be my official death bot, right? So we could have authorized versions of our digital selves in the workplace. We could say, you can't use without my permission this digital bot, even if I work for you or whatever. Or it could be part of work negotiations. I just saw this morning that Salesforce, which is the big company that does customer relations management, is rolling out voice bots for all of their customer service management work that is trained on presumably the millions and millions of hours of customer service voices that they have had from their employees. But when those employees signed up, they agreed to give over their rights to that voice. Anyway, I think we will want to have a sense of ownership over our personal clones once this all rolls out and it's not just a bunch of random apps that we're using. Because what sense does it make to lock any of that down legally right now? But in maybe 10 years, we could have a situation where there's an official clone of you, and that's the one that gets to do X, Y, and Z.
Well, Jay, with trembling conscience, I'm gonna tentatively raise the Marxist point for you, though. Do you really wanna outsource your most cherished memories to commercial companies and have Google do a little product placement in the voice and visage of your dearly departed to increase the chances that you get into the product? I mean, these are companies that have a bad track record in terms of surveillance capitalism and in terms of opening back doors for hackers, if we're talking about Facebook or Meta. And then you'll have these platforms controlling memory essentially and controlling our most vulnerable moments. And by the by, I mean, if my grandma tells me, you should really upgrade to iPhone 16, maybe I'm more prone to do it than if Mr. Cook sends me a simulated email to do that. So, I mean, I think that does also raise some questions.
Well, most of what you described is already the case now, right? We're already deeply embedded in these systems.
Except less psychologically compelling, right?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, okay, if you say that you can only be in the first place, I don't believe in the authentic self, so it's not a matter of personal authenticity or something. But if you're saying that you can only be an authentic self when you disentangled all of the things that you identify with from things that are produced by corporate capitalism, good luck. It's like, are you weaving your own clothes out of deer fur you found in your yard? What are you doing here? We all are.
I aim for that.
Right. We're all weaving together our sense of self out of the affordances that we have available to us, which are produced in this world mostly by capitalism. Now, do I think it would be great to experiment with cooperative and non-capitalistic forms of identity creation or just self-creation in the world? Yeah, of course. And should we support that? Yes, as a social experiment. But if for the meantime, it's going to be big tech. And then the question is, what does it mean then to have these democratic or expressive concerns in terms of policy? And I think it means that we have to regulate to ensure privacy, as the EU is already doing, right? The EU already says you cannot use big data algorithms to manipulate people's behavior without telling them that you're doing so. And that we will come after you if you do, right? And so that would apply in this context if your grandma starts trying to get you to buy Cheerios or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nir, quickly, because I think this is relevant. Nora Lindman, she's a philosopher who came out with an article called The Ethics of Deathbots in the journal Science and Engineering Ethics. And she is also very sensitive to the commercialization worries surrounding deathbots that you're raising now, right? Deathbots kind of being sucked up into the corpus of surveillance capitalism and just, so much sensitive data associated with the creation of a deathbot. And she proposes a regulatory approach to kind of combat against this commercialization. And I'm curious to get both of your perspectives on it. And she proposes that deathbots be kind of regulated as medical devices, right? Where they would require rigorous testing. They would be limited to being used under psychological or psychiatric supervision. And the purpose of this is kind of like maintaining the dignity of the dead, right? And combating against the commercialization worries that we were just talking about. And so the analogy here is kind of like treating digital remains like archaeological remains, restricting their complete capitalization, and again, regulating them as if they're medical devices. Does that sound like a regulatory approach that's too stringent from your perspective?
From my perspective, not stringent enough. I would ban deathbots straight out, which I think this comes pretty close to, because at least for now, I'm not seeing that there would be enough of a market to make them if they had to be prescribed by a psychiatrist, which is, I'm assuming, where this is going. But I think we have sometimes too much of a defeatist attitude about all technologies, in the sense of like, this is already here, it's going to be used, there's no possibility whatsoever in banning it, so let's find a way to regulate it, get the good without the bad. I think that sometimes that's too easy. I think there's some technologies that it's okay to ban. Actually, what actually ends up happening is for 30 years we say this is already here, there's no way of stopping it, we might as well regulate it in a way to get the good without the bad. Then we realize, oh my God, we've totally completely screwed ourselves, let's try to start banning it. So we've talked about this in a different context. Now, for example, the EU and many school systems in the United States are actually starting to ban phones because the evidence has become such that it should just not be in school. It's too destructive. And all of a sudden you're seeing, people come back to ping pong tables and to talking to each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know where I stand on this. I mean, deathbot, like, look, why would you want to create fake archaeological remains? Let's stick with the archaeological remains that we can find and with our imaginations.
I don't think this is faint. I think that this is a natural extension of people wanting to remember their dead, or people wanting to extend their own lives, like with this example from the podcast of the guy who just wanted his knowledge to be accessible to people in the future in an easy conversational way. Now, whatever motivations people have for wanting to create these kinds of bots, personally, and I agree with your idea that there should be some kind of consenting process. When people are recreated before the concept was ever there, we can't, we only can do it without their consent. In the future, we should, talk to people. It should be one of the things. Do you want to be cremated or buried? Would you like a digital memorial or not? That kind of thing. Yeah. Now, so I do not, and I think there is absolutely no evidence the experiments that have been done so far have been psychologically damaging to anyone. It's simply been a way for people to process their own grief for a brief period of time, and most people only use them for a brief period of time because they have very limited utility. Now, I think the general thing that I do agree with you about is that we have to monitor the space, because like the EU legislation that's already addressing this, the possibility for extremely addictive applications, I think, is there. Applications, and with the Cyrano effect, I think of it as like, I prefer my digital self to my actual self, and as a consequence, I never meet anybody. I only send my digital self out, and then people identifying more with digital versions of people. I think that's something we do have to think about because it will eventually happen. But I don't think the wobots are the problem yet.
Yeah, I know we have to move to our news roundup in a minute, but let me step back from grief bots for a second. Imagine the most useful scenario of these clones that I can imagine, and see what you think about it. I'm trying to challenge my own skepticism here, so bear with me. Say a parent has a job that keeps them away from home for very long stretches of time. So again, not death bots. Be this somebody who has to go on business trips, or be this somebody who's posted on military service abroad and only makes it home once in a while, and also has a limited degree of communication. Their absence is problematic for their kids. That's pretty straightforward. Maybe even damaging for their kids, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. Under those circumstances, I could see a voice clone or a bot parent being better than a teddy bear, or being better than a
being
sort of
preferred to you.
yeah. Well, either being preferred, or even if it's not preferred, it's a way of filling the void, which I guess the question, a little bit like we had in our debate about chatbot psychotherapy. If the alternative is nothing, right, is a voice bot of Jay, if Jay can't be there for one reason or another, better for their kids than nothing. And here, even as a Luddite, if there could be evidence that would suggest this is psychologically beneficial for kids who otherwise would suffer some kind of harm, it would be hard to make the case against it. What's your sense of that,
Cody?
Yeah, well, I'm going to use this as an excuse to briefly talk about the scarcity thesis, because I agree, right? There's this kind of juxtaposition between what Danaher calls more is more versus less is more, right? The more is the kind of point that you're getting at, Nir, right? Whereas it's like, it's always better to have more of a good thing, right? So whether, in your example, fatherly presence in the home, right? So Danaher distinguishes between two kinds of then the less is more part is there seems to be some intuition that an individual's scarcity contributes to their value in life somehow, right? Like the fact that we only exist for a certain amount of time and then we die, that we're limited by geographical limitations. There's something valuable in that. So there is this kind of like juxtaposition of this more and more intuition and this less is more intuition.
Just, can I pause there? I think one of the ways to think about that is that, say, spending quality time with your kids is equal to a per hour value of 1, and sending your digital clone to interact with them, the kids and you both only value a 0.5. But if that can do it, right, if you can do a lot more of that, and cut back 1 hour a week on your personal quality time, you have a max benefit, right? So
yeah. And yeah, the last distinction that I think is relevant here is instrumental scarcity versus intrinsic scarcity, right? Instrumental scarcity is just the fact that what you're talking about, Nir, right? The soldier, you can't be everywhere at once, right? You can't be doing your duties in the military, being with your family, et cetera, et cetera. Digital duplicates eliminate instrumental scarcity, right? Because it allows you to kind of like offload different functions of your life to your digital duplicate, which could be a good thing, particularly in the kind of example that you're talking about. Now, I think there are diminishing returns to that, right? Like if you have like some band and you can have like a holographic digital duplicate version of them playing everywhere at all times, it might be kind of like less interesting to go see them because you can see them whenever. Now, intrinsic scarcity.
The Brits did that with ABBA, by the way, actually, with ABBA hologram shows in London.
So it's like more is more up to a certain extent, but then it becomes less is more. But then, yeah, your intrinsic scarcity is just like the fact that you're a non-replicable, unique individual, right? Like no individual precisely like you with your exact psychology memories will ever exist again. And Danaher and Nahom argue that digital duplicates, while they can lead to less instrumental scarcity, they can't really undermine your intrinsic scarcity, right? Even the most sophisticated, perfect digital duplicates that you can imagine, right? They're at best still going to be mere simulations or representations, right? So I thought that's kind of an interesting piece of it too, that distinction.
I
And
mean,
the last point is I think that your intrinsic value might actually go up in a world of digital duplicates because like if there are so many different versions of Cody, people might find it more meaningful to actually engage with the real Cody in a way that they didn't prior to the advent of digital duplicates, right?
Well, I think that's the music example you were struggling for there is that instead of radio killing the video, killing the music performance, people not wanting to go see music, is that the more digital versions of people that we see, the more we fall in love with the parasocial relationship with the artist or whatever, and the more that we are motivated to actually want to see them in the flesh, right? So it could be that what is the biggest problem in heterosexual relationships according to comedians? It's that men don't communicate enough. Well, what if we had a self that actually did our communication, right? That got past our obsession with the Roman Empire and actually told our significant others what we were thinking. It could improve all of our love lives, is what I'm telling you, Nir. This could be the solution to the fertility crisis.
or your partner would only want to talk with your chatbot, and you would be
you
left
feel
in
jealous.
the dark thinking about the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and jealous of being cuckolded by yourself.
If your digital duplicate struck up a romantic relationship with someone else, would you feel like you cheated on your spouse?
There we go.
Blew my head. My memory got exceeded.
First, we pound on Nir to get him to not be a Luddite, and then we just wait till his head explodes. Well, today, I thought we might just briefly go through the argument that I made in a recent piece on Substack, Free IVF, Techno-Progressive Policy and Reproductive Rights. I just thought it was fascinating when I dug into the issue of IVF, because I got excited when IVF became a topic in this debate. It actually became a topic when Alabama decided that they were going to pursue fetal personhood laws that would effectively ban the practice of IVF, because IVF always involves the creation of excess embryos. Way back in like 1991, I think was one of the first test cases in Tennessee, where a father sued for the disposition of frozen embryos in an IVF procedure after he had divorced the woman who wanted to not use them or use them, whichever it was. He wanted to make sure that they weren't destroyed. And the judge ruled back in like 1991 in Tennessee that all frozen embryos had to be implanted because they were human beings, which would make the whole the fertility industry go nuts. But when you look into what people who are against abortion, so the abortion ideologues are opposed to IVF because they want to ban this, the practice of disposing of embryos. When you look into what the actual voters who are complete pro-life, anti-abortion in all circumstances, only 20% of them are opposed to IVF. Because IVF is a pronatal procedure, right? It helps people have babies. What they're really concerned about is, the culture war against contraception and abortion, not really embryo disposal policies. So at any rate, when Trump unthinkingly, and without any real, I'm sure there was no discussion in the Trump team about, should I offer free IVF to everybody who wants it, which can cost up to $150,000 because it takes like an average of 6 administrations of IVF for people to be even above the threshold of 50% success, something like that. And each administration costs $12,000 to $15,000. So the budgetary implications, and this is where, like, I'm a socialist, I want free universal health care, and I think we should put as much into free universal health care as we possibly can. But when I got to this topic, it's like, well, if when we're going to be talking about the expenditures of Medicare, Medicaid, Medicare for all, whatever it's going to be, do we really think that free universal access to this very expensive procedure, which is not a medical condition, right? That's the other thing, is that infertility is just an incompatibility between your desires and what your body can do. For me, it's the same as saying, I would like to be an Olympic athlete, but I would need these 5 genetic surgeries in order for me to compete at an Olympic level. And so my desire to be an Olympic athlete, people, I'm sorry, I'm just ranting this way, but people, we've debated already, Gattaca. Here he wants to be an astronaut. He's got a broken body. Does he have a right to go to the society and say, because I want to be an astronaut, you have to give me extraordinary medical therapies to achieve that? Now, I think there's universal support for expanding fertility access, and I think we should do it. it should, of course, come as a part of the expansion of healthcare rights in general. But I just wanted to throw this issue on the table because I thought it was so fascinating. And the last thing I'll say is it's also a transhumanist issue insofar as we're making choices about which embryos should be born. Those choices have a moral logic to them. And that's something that people don't talk about enough.
I mean, just on that last point, I mean, I do think there's a pretty strong argument to say that fertility is part of baseline health, and that therefore something like IVF would be, by definition, a therapy rather than an enhancement, and therefore have a stronger argument for it to be covered by insurance.
Well, okay, fertility is part of baseline health. Fertility of the 60-year-old woman. I mean, if we're going to say that the ability
at least for some people right, like the kind of whatever average case,
it's just would be part of it. If we define it, it's an ongoing debate in the literature, but if we define it as a health condition, it's a very unusual one, right? Because it doesn't limit, infertility in general is not a limitation on your ability, doesn't cause pain, doesn't shorten your life expectancy. It's just a limitation of this one capacity. I
mean, it causes, but to some people, causes profound psychological pain.
Correct. Like any psychiatric condition, which also has technological affordances, right? We could give people.
And those also wouldn't be health conditions?
Well, I think that if being depressed about, so people say about transgender, and I don't accept the logic, but they say, well, it's actually a psychological condition, right? That you're gender dysphoria, and it should be treated psychologically, which means give people drugs so that they can be happy, or therapy so they can be happy again. But it has this technological affordance that does the work and that people are happier with than trying to, go through gender reassignment therapy.
So I guess the argument that you're making is that it's difficult to define what a baseline health condition is, right, and that opens up a can of worms in terms of public policy?
Yes, and I think we don't give enough attention. And the other example I use in the piece is breast reconstruction after mastectomy. Again, we don't need breasts. But there's almost universal understanding and acceptance that state health systems and private health systems should pay for breast reconstruction after a mastectomy in order to provide the psychological benefits that accrue. And for that reason, I think there are arguments for things like gender affirming therapy after a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, or for treatment of infertility. I'm not arguing against infertility treatment. I'm arguing for fertility treatment and for the way that it expands our understanding of what should be provided by the state.
So then are you saying that your criterion for what counts as a baseline health condition to be covered by insurance has to be more connected to how subjectively painful this is for people, or is it a cost-benefit kind of argument? Or
no, put it in a positive way, which is what the UN, the WHO's founding charter document that defines the mission of health. It defines health including psychological well-being, right? So any condition that we can treat, and this will change over time because we'll have more and more technological affordances that can improve well-being. And so we'll have more and more claims to use those affordances for the purposes of health. I'm just saying the strict definition that all medicine should be keyed to therapeutic treatment of disease is already in violation, and we should recognize that.
So that's a really interesting argument. Cody, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I read the piece, Jay, and I really enjoyed it. This is not a topic that I was particularly educated on. I mean, generally, I'm very pro-universal healthcare. So I think that, yes, there should be free IVF in the limit, regardless of whether how we adjudicate the debate y'all were just having between whether it's regarded as a kind of therapy or a kind of enhancement because it's not actually like curing a disease, and like how do we define what health is? Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe there's like a right to enhancement in the limit too. So one aspect, also one thing I thought was really interesting is what you already said, Jay, just how there are like fetal personhood ideologues who are against IVF, but then if you actually poll the pro-life voters, they're actually for it because it's pro-natalist, right? Even if there is this argument that, yeah, during the IVF process, there are multiple embryos, and if you consider that embryo a person, and then you there's excess embryos and you set that aside, technically you're killing a person. I think that kind of tension in the kind of conservative ideology is very interesting. One kind of interesting philosophical thing that I took, or that I'm curious about thinking about more from the piece, is this procreative beneficence. I don't know if I'm saying that correct.
Beneficence.
Beneficence, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm understanding this, but this is from the bioethicist Julian
Savulescu. Yeah.
Savulescu. And right, so he argues that, okay, during a process of IVF, right, there's all these different multiple embryos, and theoretically you could choose between those embryos and kind of determine which embryo has the best shot of having a good life, right? So you might argue that there's an obligation that the parents have to choose the child that's expected to have the best life, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, this embryo, based on like our scientific analysis of it, is less likely to have a particular disease, whatever. You link to an article in your Substack piece by Walter Veit, where he takes that principle and says, well, that could actually entail that there is a commitment to actually genetically enhance one's child, right? Like if you accept that principle that you have an obligation as a parent to choose the embryo during an IVF process that has the best shot of having a good life, when more sophisticated genetic enhancement technologies come online and the possibility of designer babies becomes a real thing, then following that logic, does it also entail that parents have an obligation to genetically enhance their children such that they have the best foreseeable life? And if it does follow, that seems like a potential reductio ad absurdum on that argument, depending on what your intuitions are, given that designer babies are just very ethically controversial. And usually the discussion surrounding designer babies is whether they're permissible at all, not whether parents have an obligation to create designer babies.
You caught me, Cody. You caught me. Yes, I do think that the principle of procreative beneficence lends itself immediately to the question of enhancement therapy with prenatal genetic modification. And the logic I would use is: do we think, if once we discover that alcohol during pregnancy is bad for a child, do we have an obligation not to drink alcohol during our pregnancy? Yes. If we discover that eating spinach during our pregnancy will have a demonstrable benefit on our child's cognitive abilities in the future, do we have a moral obligation to do that? Yes. Now, the limits of how much of your life you should deform in order to be the perfect breeding vehicle, I don't think we should push it too far. But when a parent is presented with a choice like, your child has a 50% chance of dying before the age of 10 in a horrible and painful way, but if we tweak them in this particular way, they won't have that thing, and they will most likely will have a 99% chance of never having that problem. Do you have an obligation to do that? Yeah, I think you have an obligation to do that, and that's the beginning of the conversation about which things we are presented with as choices we have obligations towards our children, how much risk and cost should be included in those calculations, and so forth. But it begins with the fact that you have 12 embryos in front of you in IVF, and you can only insert 3 at a time or so whatever, which is even still one of the problems with IVF is the practice of multiple uses of multiple embryos, because that can cause risks too. But they do that for ensuring the probability of success. But say if you're going to implant 3 out of the 12, which 3 do you implant, and then which do you throw away? So I think that choice, and that's the choice. That's part of the choice, at least at the beginning of Gattaca. They go to the parents and they say, well, we could tweak. I think it was actually a tweaking situation. We could tweak the embryo so that it doesn't have any of these problems, or you could just go in blind and get what you get. And they go in blind, and it turns out not to be a good hand. So at any rate, I think this is the choice we're already at with IVF, have been at for a long time, and people just start paying attention. And when a conservative comes in and says, oh, I'm just going to give it to everybody, it's like, okay, dude, let's talk. Let's rock and roll.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you really raise also the bigger philosophical question of what it would take to scuttle the therapy enhancement distinction, what it would take for an insurance company, for example, to scuttle that distinction and say it's not anymore the case that we will strictly only consider paying for therapies and not for enhancements, because if I understand the argument correctly, in a variety of areas, it's actually enhancements that can mean more to us psychologically than therapeutic interventions. And have more of an impact on our life than therapeutic interventions. And therefore, there's an argument to cover them as much as, if not more, than therapies. And mainly there seems to be an argument to come up with a different criterion than that distinction.
Right. That is precisely my argument, is that we should set aside the therapy enhancement distinction in determining what our healthcare priorities should be and go on a maximization of well-being metric, against cost, how the cost per metric of well-being that we can generate, and that things on the enhancement side will in the future generate as much or more value, and that those should be on the table too. Now, I still think that there's a question about, on the cost side, that there are certain things that we can't afford to do because of their risks and their costs for everybody, even if they were beneficial. And those things should probably be in the market. So that's a whole nother discussion. But
and then we'll get bogged down probably by how objective or subjective the test for well-being is going to be. But there's no, like Aristotle would say, there's no mathematical criterion for answering these questions anyway.
That's right. Yeah, if you look at the Oregon, I think is one of the most instructive examples, because they did, for the determination of their quality adjusted life year inspired version of healthcare rationing, they did all these town hall meetings, and they generally agreed we want to spend more on preventive care and kids and less on end of life care and so forth. But then when it got down to actually saying whether they were going to cut particular treatments out of the state Medicaid funding program, it's like no liver transplants for the terminally ill. It's like, oh, well, we didn't really mean that, right? So there's the kind of abstract logic of consequentialist reasoning, and when then it has to meet political reality, and it always gets changed a little bit. And I'm fine. That's the nature of the beast.
All right, friends. I think we are out of time for today, but that was fascinating on both of those topics.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
I know.
Thanks for joining us, Cody.
Thanks for inviting me on. I really enjoyed the conversation. Pleasure to be here.
All right.
Talk to you all next week.